Well, Happy New Year. I hope everybody's had a good few days celebrating and had a good Christmas holiday. My name's Farah Rains, and my husband Nick and I have been coming to recovery here since June of 23. And I'm here tonight to share my testimony. So I usually, over the course of my life, I teach and work with kids. So you guys scare me a little bit. All these adults, I'm like, whew, that's a little much. But anyway, I read everything out, so hopefully we'll be all right. But before I get started, I do want to send a shout out to Mark and Carol. I know they're watching online, and just want to say thank you to them and the rest of the leadership and staff here for giving me this opportunity. So thanks. The last several years have been pretty wild, so I'm just gonna dive right in. I grew up just down the road in Maryville, Tennessee, and I was raised in a Christian home. And although I experienced some difficulties, I'd say that most of my childhood was pretty good. The summer I turned 5, I quickly learned how to be distant and to put up protective walls around my heart as I experienced abuse for the first time. While there was some physical abuse over the next 10 years, the mental and emotional abuse proved to be much more damaging. As I grew up, I was shy, but I had a quiet confidence about me. At 7, I had my first real encounter with Jesus. I'd known him my whole life, but I was saved. And a few weeks later, I was baptized down in the river. At that point, Jesus was not only my Savior, but he became my best friend. 6 weeks after my 13th birthday, I saw my husband Nick for the first time. I didn't know his name, but I instantly knew that I would marry him one day. The same was true for him, and almost exactly 7 years later, we were married. Soon after, we were living in Georgia, pastoring a very large and active youth program. And in 2002, we had the most beautiful and perfect baby girl who's now pregnant with my first grandbaby. So excited about that. And in 2005, we had the most handsome and perfect baby boy. Soon we moved back home to Tennessee and we started a church. Aside from my relationship with the Lord and being a wife and mother were my highest priorities and my greatest earthly blessings. Next came our church. Because we started it from the ground up, it felt like a third baby to me in a lot of ways. The people in the church became our family. Several of those are with us tonight. We did life together, and it was really special. From time to time over the years, though, I would notice that something felt off in my spirit. I would pray, and the Lord would show me that I still had unforgiveness in my heart toward the person who'd abused me. I had forgiven many times, but somewhere along the way, I would pick it back up and didn't even realize it most of the time. In 2016, I was in a car accident, and after a year of constant pain due to nerve damage, I was beginning to lose function and the use of my left arm and hand. So I had neck surgery that did fix the most of the problems that I was having, but after the surgery, I could only whisper. And while this was normal and expected for a couple of weeks, after 6 weeks, I was still whispering. And so I was sent to a specialist, and tests determined that my right vocal cord had been severed during the neck surgery. And I was told that the damage was likely permanent, but we wouldn't know for sure until about 6 months. We'd just kind of have to wait. But I knew that God could heal me. And one night, about 4.5 months into the waiting, I told God that I trusted him, and I cried myself to sleep. Several hours later in the early morning, I woke up from a bad dream, and I was screaming out the name of Jesus. So from that point, my voice was back. I could teach, I could yell at my son's football games, which I was really sad that I was not able to be that mom in the stands going crazy. I could sing and worship, and I could harmonize, which to some is not a big deal, but I had never been able to do that. So God healed my vocal cord and gave me a little extra, which I thought was pretty cool. I went back to see my specialist, and he was dumbfounded and just said he had no clue what had happened, but the vocal cord was not only healed, it was a completely new vocal cord. So praise the Lord. In 2018, I was in a life group that changed my life. It was about the Holy Spirit, and my father-in-law taught that group. He challenged us every single week to pray a very simple prayer. It was just, Lord, show me, change me, and fill me. I sincerely prayed that prayer every day, and the Lord answered me. In his gentleness and with great love, God began to shape me and mold me. It wasn't always pleasant, but I allowed him to chip away the rough edges and begin to tear down the protective walls that I had put up around my heart. God spoke to me during that year more than he ever had in my entire life, and my roots grew deeper and deeper into his love. Through the process, though, it became very clear to me that I had bitterness in my heart due to unforgiveness. Over the next few months, through a series of difficult events, I was greatly humbled and brought very low before the Lord. I felt a deep conviction, and I confessed every sin that I could remember from the time I was 4 years old. Nick got to hear all of that. I confessed to the Lord, but needed to do it out loud to another human. So during a prayer service, just a short time later, I ended up writing a letter to the person who had abused me. And although the letter was never sent, it helped me to give that person and all of my hurt back over to the Lord and to truly, truly forgive. God took out a heart that had become stony, and he replaced it, and he gave me a new heart that was just filled with love and compassion. And he reminded me over and over to make sure my roots were deep in his love. I then felt that it was urgent that I be baptized again. I was a little concerned about what some people would think, being that I was the pastor's wife, but on March 10th of 2018, I was baptized by my husband. And then in July of 2019, my health began to greatly decline. I became, and still am in many ways, a shell of what I was before. Physically, mentally, emotionally, and hormonally, I was a mess. Nick was the only one who knew the depths of it. Panic attacks, depression, anxiety, sleeplessness, constant pain, and much more riddled my body. Every doctor I saw said that I was a mystery. Some things they could confirm with tests, some things just couldn't be determined. But no matter what we did, none of the medicines had any effect on me. They just wouldn't work for whatever reason. And then in July of 21, after hours of symptoms that were like a stroke, and I was going in and out of consciousness, the hospital sent me home because there were no answers. I knew at that moment that there was a very spiritual element to whatever was happening with me, and I endlessly scoured every corner of my mind and heart to try to find the source, but I couldn't find anything. I begged and I pleaded with God to help me. At times, the torment would ease up for quite a while, and at other times, it was almost more than I could bear. I pushed through day in and day out for almost 4 years, doing my best to dig deeper in my relationship with the Lord. During this time, we moved into a large multifamily home in 2021. Over the next 3 months, our daughter got engaged. My mother-in-law was diagnosed with cancer, and my 92-year-old grandmother came to live with us. At only 9 months after her diagnosis, my mother-in-law, who was a mother to me, she passed away. That was really hard for all of us, and we still miss her greatly. 6 weeks later, though, our daughter got married, and we got an amazing son-in-law. And over the next few months, my grandma began to have a lot of small strokes very often, and she ended up having 2 heart attacks, and I couldn't care for her the way that she needed to be, so she had to be placed into a facility where she could receive the care that she needed. So there had been much heartache, but through it all, God was just, he was very, very good, and he was very kind, and he was very loving to us. Toward the end of January of 23, things got a lot worse. The panic attacks became relentless. The anxiety, all of the things that went along with that. Everything felt very dark for me. And for the first time that I had remembered in my entire life, I couldn't hear God anymore. I had always talked to him, and I had learned over the years how to hear his voice, but I couldn't. And by March, even though I wanted to live, I didn't want to die, I would wake up all throughout the night with thoughts of suicide. On a Sunday morning, I finally heard God speak to me again. I was on the front row of church holding Nick's hand. The band was playing the song Firm Foundation, which had a lot of meaning to me over the couple of years prior. And God spoke to me and told me to go on the stage. He said he would tell me what to say when I got up there. I was terrified, but I had to obey. So after hesitating, I walked onto the stage and I said a few things about God being my foundation and his promises and standing firm. But what I really remember at the end was just very brief, but I said, I will worship God come what may. I had no idea what was around the corner. Just 3 short weeks later, on the night of April 20th, 23, I found out that Nick, my husband, of almost 24 years, had been unfaithful to me over the course of the previous 4 years. If you were here back in, I think the end of April, early May, he shared his testimony. So those of you that were here, you'll know all the details of that. But I couldn't catch my breath. I literally thought that I was going to die. I thought my heart was going to explode. It was just beating so fast and so hard. Nick was the only person that I had ever truly trusted, I think, and who knew everything about me other than the Lord. And I felt, in my mind, we were like the fairy tale. We were the fairy tale that many people dreamed of, and in an instant, everything changed. I looked at him and I wasn't even sure if I had known him at all. Several hours later, in the middle of the night, we were standing outside with Nick and our associate pastor, who had also been a long-term friend. And I said, I won't allow something like this to happen to my family and it not be used for the glory of God. I meant it. I still mean it. Things began to unfold very quickly. And while I had moments of clarity, I was mostly in a fog. I caught myself questioning if what was happening was real life. It felt like a blur and like it couldn't be real. Life as we'd known it was over. I hurt inside and out. I couldn't formulate sentences, even to pray. As I looked through Nick's phone and saw the timeline of the infidelity, I realized that it perfectly matched with the timeline of my health decline that started in July of 2019, which is when his indiscretion began. The times that I was at my very worst, he was in the depths of his sin. And the times that I felt better, he wasn't cheating. On Sunday, a couple days later, I allowed Nick to come upstairs to watch our church service with the kids and me. We all sobbed the entire time, and the announcement was made that Nick was being put on disciplinary leave. It was difficult, but we knew that it was necessary. The church then had a time of prayer and worship, and at this point, I still couldn't even look at Nick. I was across the room, and God kept telling me to go kneel in front of him and hold his hand. It made me nauseous. The thought of it it made me angry, it made me mad, and even though years before I had promised God that I would obey him the first time every time, that I would do my best, I was arguing with him. I argued and I hesitated for several minutes before I forced myself to obey him. But as soon as I knelt in front of him and held Nick's hand, I felt a sense of peace. The band was playing a song called Healer, which also had great importance to me years before. And I knew that God was going to do something. I knew he was going to heal what had happened. After several days of only a few hours of very broken sleep, I finally slept on Monday night. I woke up that morning to God speaking to me, and he was just saying the word remember over and over and over. And I'm like, okay, give me a minute, let me wake up. I don't know what I'm supposed to remember right now. But that's all I could hear was just remember. And so after a minute, I knew that I needed to pull out my journals and my notes and different things from prior years and look back. And on page after page, I had written about God's faithfulness and about his goodness. I was reminded of dreams that I'd had, that other people had had. I read words that he had given to me through numerous people who had no clue at all what I was dealing with. And he reminded me of a particular time that had been pretty difficult, and God had just kept telling me that my life was in his hands. He'd been preparing me for years for what was happening, and I had no clue. He'd been preparing me, and I didn't know what all these things at the moment that I was now looking at in my journals, I didn't know what they meant some of the time when I wrote them down, but it was all beginning to make some sense. At that moment, I told God that I would choose to live and not die. I got up, I got ready. I went to visit with my grandma, and I stopped in to see Cindy. Cindy was someone in our church who I barely knew, but she had reached out to me because she lived through a similar circumstance, and she had survived. She had encouraged me, gave me a few books, and then I went back home. When I walked through the doorway of my home, my legs became very weak beneath me, and this wasn't new. It had happened numerous times over the previous 5 days, but this time it was very different. It wasn't because of the grief that I was feeling. It was because the presence of God was so heavy in my house. He spoke to me very clearly, some very specific things, and instantly there was this heaviness that was lifted off of me. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in 4 years. He instantly healed me from everything that had plagued me in those 4 years. There was no more anxiousness, no more panic attacks, depression, all of those things. It was instantly gone. I still have pain from the injuries that were from my car accident, but even that is not as bad as it was. I think the other things that were happening were making the pain worse. Everything was gone. And throughout the rest of the day, I went all over the entire house and I prayed inside and out. Later that same evening, the board of elders came to our home and Nick confessed his sin to them. Afterward, God told me again to hold Nick's hand and to this time pray over him and to pray deliverance and healing. It was difficult, but I obeyed. And that night, God delivered Nick from anger that he had wrestled with his entire life. In the midst of this fire, God was bringing relief, and he was giving us hope. I never knew that he could be so close. Everything around me and in me felt like chaos, yet he was bringing perfect peace. Our children, they were hurting and they were confused. Our church was reeling, and I was falling apart. And the person who was supposed to love, care for, and protect us had caused it all. I didn't understand the extent of what all God was doing, but over the next few days and weeks, he performed miracle after miracle. I felt like I was split into two. Part of me felt better than I had in years, and then the other part of me was just completely broken and distraught. But in the pain, I had hope. My brain could not function very well most of the time, but at times I would remember that I had stood on a stage and said that I would worship God come what may. I didn't have words, but I commanded my soul to worship, even if it was through weeping and groaning. And within a couple of days, I was able to sit at my piano, and although it was through tears, I played and sang, "It is well with my soul." Because even though the world was falling around me, it was well with my soul. Soon, I wanted what God wanted more than what I wanted. The days and the weeks ahead were filled with pain, humiliation, anger, confusion, sadness, and dread. I sat in meetings with elders and staff as the horrific events of the last 4 years were detailed. I sat in church with our children as the leaders read a much too explicit statement explaining why Nick would no longer be their pastor. The unimaginable was happening, and I felt like I had to suck it up and put on a brave face. I felt like I was being forced to wear the shame of Nick's sin as others looked at me with disgust. I had to go to our niece's wedding and take family pictures without a husband. It was right at the time of our son's graduation and his 18th birthday. They were overshadowed. I had questions in my head and from others. I had triggering moments and debilitating fear that were continual. I was distraught and exhausted, and I had no clue what to do moving forward. I was terrified and my brain was in trauma mode, and because of this, my friend Cindy advised me to wait a year before making any major decisions. It seemed like an eternity. But I agreed. I knew that I would always love Nick, but I couldn't begin to imagine how we could remain married. We learned about something called redemptive separation, and we decided to try it. There's lots of details there, but Nick was already living downstairs with his dad, and we were reading books and trying to find resources. We met individually with Cindy and her husband, Todd, weekly. And at the end of May, Nick went to a workshop in Minnesota called Faithful and True. It's something that's specifically for men who are bound by sexual addiction. Before he left, God spoke to me and told me to pray for baby Nick, because once baby Nick healed, grown-up Nick could begin to heal too. We started attending recovery here shortly after that in June, and we learned really quickly the importance of sharing within community. We'd put some strict boundaries around our separation and realized the first goal had to be to heal individually. I desperately wanted to handle this situation correctly, so I knew that I had to listen and obey God. I was clueless and had no control anyway, so I surrendered to him. I'm still surrendering over and over. I wanted to remain soft and pliable in God's hands and to be a good example to our children. I knew that forgiveness was the only option I had. I had felt the sting of bitterness in years past, and I refused to let my heart harden again. By this time, most everyone I knew had pulled away. The kids and I had done nothing wrong, but we were becoming outcast. I fully understand that the people in our lives were hurting. They were broken and they didn't know what to do either. And what's also true is I'm not sure that I will ever be able to wrap my brain around the rejection of my children. I'm not angry at anyone, I'm just really sad. And I feel like they're missing out on a really great redemptive story. In July, I made the difficult decision to leave the church that we had started, the only church our kids had ever known. I stepped down from ministry and away from many that I dearly loved. And this has truly been one of the deepest pains over the last 21 months. That loss has been great. I was living in a state of worry and fear and just waiting for the rug to be pulled out from me at any point. I had no control, and it was maddening. I really, really wanted control. I felt strongly that there was something that I didn't know. There was still something else. But I'd learned that the truth is always revealed, so I continued and tried to be patient. Nick was attending a new church, and I decided to join him. I cried the entire first service because I felt like I was cheating on my church. Soon we shared our big mess with the pastor and his wife. I was very scared to do that because I felt like they would reject us. I just didn't know if we would be welcome, but they did the opposite. In time, our children and other family members have joined us at the church, and although the transition has been pretty hard, it's also been a great source of healing for our family. I'd begun therapy, and over my birthday weekend at the end of July, I went to Minneapolis to a workshop for betrayed wives. It was life-changing. I learned so much about myself, about the science behind sexual addiction, and I gained a lot of tools that I still use almost daily. I also met a great, amazing group of women, and we still communicate and encourage each other regularly. The feeling that I didn't know everything began to burn in me. I had asked Nick over and over, but he insisted I knew it all. We had just started couples counseling and were nearing a formal disclosure, but after a difficult weekend, I decided that I didn't want to wait for the disclosure. I didn't want to wait till we met with our therapist. And so Nick fully opened up to me, and I learned the one detail that had been left unsaid. And while in the scheme of everything that was going on, it didn't seem like a big deal, I went backwards. I felt like I was back at the beginning again. And it took me a little while to kind of regain my footing. So I did, and we continued with the healing process. And after about 6 months, we ended the separation. We had learned that at that point, if you stay separated beyond the 6-month point, the chances of divorce increase greatly. So we had a lot to figure out with all of that, but we ended the separation at 6 months. Things have been one step forward and 2 steps back along the way. We've had every difficult conversation imaginable, met with mentors and leaders, read books, met with individual and couples therapists, had much counseling, been to workshops, listened to hundreds of podcasts, written letters of impact and restitution, fellowshipped with trusted friends and family, served in our church, celebrated wins, and mourned losses. The enemy thought that he had won, but here we are, still breathing, still pressing forward. Along the way, I've learned not to say I would never, because that puts me in the driver's seat and not the Lord, and I want what he wants more than what I want. I've learned that as much as I want to be in control, I really don't have any control anyway. God's ways are much higher than mine, and surrendering is worth it. I've learned that most people will run from a fire, but God places specific people to help you put the fire out and to sift through the ashes that remain. I'll forever be grateful to those who have stood by our sides. And I realize that God has used this to show me that even if I only have him, I have all I need. We frail humans will fail one another time and time again, but God won't. He can't. I'd be lying if I said I didn't have some fear of the future. Some of the consequences of Nick's sin are still unfolding, but it's all in the hands of a very capable God. I want to be a healed helper for those who are hurting. I want to embrace not only the prostitute and the addict, but the people in the sanctuary who think they can hold it all together. I want to help others heal and receive freedom that can only come through Jesus. I've felt pain I thought would kill me, but what I've felt more is the unending love and nearness of God, the comfort, peace, and power of the Holy Spirit, and the great hope of the promise of salvation. God's mercy triumphs over judgment, and I've seen the goodness of God over and over. Much healing is still to come, but I'm more free, closer to Jesus, have more peace and joy than I have had in years. I'm more confident, and while the road ahead is long, I'm okay with that. There are more hurdles to jump and more layers to peel back, but as long as God is leading the way, I'm going to continue to follow. There's much I may never understand, but there are a few things that I know for sure. God is always good, he's always faithful, he's always kind, and he's very, very close to the brokenhearted. As long as there's breath in our bodies, there's hope for our soul. God's love is boundless and covers it all. He redeems, restores, and makes all things new. There's great purpose in the pain, and God uses it all for his glory if we let him. I'm bruised and a little battered, but I've made the decision that I will stand. I will worship God with my whole heart, come what may. That's it. Thank you for letting me share.